Think about the last paycheck you received. Before it ever reached your bank account, a piece of it was already gone. Taken before you saw it, before you touched it, before you had any say in the matter. You've never questioned it. You've never known anything else. It feels like it's always been this way. Like income tax is simply part of what it means to be an American. As old as the flag, as permanent as the Constitution itself. But here's the thing. It isn't. Not even close. For 137 years, longer than the income tax has existed today, the United States government took nothing from your wages. Nothing from your salary, nothing from the money you earned with your own two hands. Picture it. A farmer in 1850 selling his harvest and keeping every last dollar. A factory worker in 1870 collecting a full week's pay, with no form to fill out, no percentage carved away, no April deadline hanging over his head. The federal government built roads, fought a civil war, pushed a nation from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and never once asked a single citizen what he earned. This is not a story about taxes. Not really. It's a story about power, about who gets to reach into your life, and when they decided they were allowed to. Because in 1913, something changed. Quietly. Technically. Almost politely. And it never changed back. So let me take you back to the very beginning. To a young republic that ran on something else entirely, and to the moment, over a century later, when that all came apart. To understand what was lost in 1913, you have to understand what came before it, and what came before it worked, for well over a century. When the United States government needed money in its earliest decades, it didn't look at a citizen's income, it looked at the border. Every time a ship pulled into an American harbor loaded with imported cloth, sugar, or iron, the government collected a tariff, a tax on goods coming in from abroad. That tariff, along with excise taxes on select goods like whiskey, was the engine. Not wages, not salaries. Not a percentage of what a man earned at his job. According to research by economic historian Douglas Irwin of Dartmouth, tariffs supplied somewhere in the neighborhood of 90% of federal revenue through most of the period stretching from the 1790s to the Civil War. 90%. Think about that. Nearly the entire operating budget of a growing nation, collected at the docks, without a single American ever opening a tax form. This is the paradise most people never hear about. And it was not small. It was not a footnote economy. With tariff and excise revenue, the federal government paid off Revolutionary War debt. It funded the Louisiana Purchase, doubling the size of the country overnight in 1803. It built roads, supported westward expansion, and eventually financed the largest war fought on American soil, the Civil War itself, before the income tax was ever seriously used. Railroads stretched from coast to coast, cities grew, industry took root. All of it funded by goods crossing a border, not by wages crossing a paycheck. But here's the thing most people don't realize. This system wasn't universally loved either. It had its own resentments, its own breaking points. Go back to 1794, just 5 years after the Constitution was ratified. Farmers in western Pennsylvania were furious, not about an income tax, because there wasn't one, but about a federal excise tax on whiskey. For men who distilled their own grain into whiskey as a practical way to transport and sell their crops, this tax felt like the new federal government reaching directly into their livelihoods. The anger boiled over into armed resistance. Farmers tarred and feathered tax collectors. Some formed militias. President Washington himself rode out with federalized troops to put down what came to be called the Whiskey Rebellion. The lesson embedded in that moment is one worth sitting with. Americans have never simply accepted taxation, of any kind, without a fight. The instinct to resist a government reaching into personal economic life is not new. It goes back to the very first generation of the Republic. But even with that resistance, the system built around tariffs and excise taxes proved remarkably durable. For one simple reason, it didn't touch the individual directly. A merchant paid a tariff when goods crossed the border. A distiller paid an excise tax on what he produced. But the average farmer, laborer, or shopkeeper going about his daily work never had to report his income to anyone. There was no federal form asking what he earned last year, no April deadline, no withholding taken before he ever saw his own money. This is the world America actually built itself in, not a stateless libertarian fantasy, because tariffs and excise taxes were real taxes, collected by a real federal government, sometimes resented and resisted, just like any tax. But it was a world where your labor, your wages, your income, the money you personally earned, belonged to you, in full, the moment you earned it. That distinction matters. It's the difference between a government that taxes commerce at its edges and a government that reaches directly into an individual's pocket. For most of the first century of American history, the federal government chose the former. And it worked, all the way up until the country tore itself in half. Because war is expensive, and when the Civil War arrived, tariffs alone weren't going to be enough. By 1861, tariffs and excise taxes were no longer enough. The Union needed to raise an army, arm it, feed it, and sustain a war that almost no one expected to last as long as it did. And for the first time in American history, the federal government reached towards something new, a tax on income itself. Congress passed the Revenue Act of 1861 and refined it further in 1862, establishing the nation's first federal income tax. It was modest by modern standards, a few percent on incomes above a certain threshold, aimed mostly at the wealthier households who could afford to shoulder the cost of the war. But modest or not, it was a line the federal government had never crossed before. For the first time, a citizen's wages, not just his purchases, became something the government could reach into. Here's the thing worth sitting with. The income tax wasn't born out of some grand philosophical shift about the proper role of government. It was born out of emergency. It was war finance, plain and simple. A temporary tool for a temporary crisis. The same way a family might dip into savings during a hard year, fully expecting to stop once things got better. And that's exactly what happened. When the war ended and the emergency passed, so did the appetite for taxing income. Congress let the tax expire, and by 1872, the federal income tax was gone, repealed, erased from the law books, with barely a fight to keep it. This detail matters more than it might seem. It proves something important. The idea of an income tax was not some undiscovered concept, unknown to the founding generation's successors, waiting to be invented in 1913. It already existed, it had already been tried, and the nation had already decided, deliberately, to let it go. For the next 2 decades, America went back to the world it knew: tariffs, excise taxes, growth funded at the border rather than the paycheck. But something else was happening underneath the surface. The country was industrializing at a pace no one had seen before. Railroads crossed the continent, factories multiplied, and with that growth came something the tariff-funded republic hadn't fully reckoned with: enormous, concentrated wealth, sitting largely untouched by the tax system built for a simpler economy. A tariff on imported goods hits everyone roughly the same, rich or poor, when they buy the same product. But it does very little to touch the fortune of a railroad baron or an industrial magnate whose wealth wasn't built on tariffs at all, but on capital, on ownership, on income the old system was never designed to see. That gap between a tax system built for the 1790s and an economy racing into the 1890s is where the next chapter of this story begins. Because reformers hadn't forgotten that the income tax once existed, they remembered, and they were about to try bringing it back. By the 1890s, the gap between America's tax system and America's economy had become impossible to ignore. This was the Gilded Age, a term coined precisely because the surface gleamed while something less flattering sat underneath. Railroad fortunes, steel fortunes, oil fortunes, a handful of families accumulating wealth on a scale the founding generation could never have imagined, while the tax system that funded the federal government still ran on the same basic logic it had used since the 1790s: tariffs on imported goods, excise taxes on select products, a system that touched a bottle of whiskey more directly than it touched a Wall Street fortune. And there was a second problem, one that hit ordinary Americans directly. Tariffs don't just tax imported luxury goods. They raise the price of everyday things, cloth, tools, household goods, for everyone, regardless of income. A tariff-funded government was, in a very real sense, a government funded disproportionately by consumption, by the purchases of working families, while enormous new fortunes sat comparatively untouched. Reformers, populists, and a growing number of ordinary Americans began asking a pointed question. If the country could tax a farmer's tools at the border, why couldn't it tax a railroad baron's income at the source? In 1894, Congress tried to answer that question. It passed a new federal income tax. Modest, again aimed at higher earners, echoing the Civil War-era tax that had once existed and then vanished. For a brief moment, it looked like the idea Congress had abandoned in 1872 was coming back. It didn't last a year. The tax was challenged almost immediately, and the case reached the Supreme Court as Pollock v. Farmers Loan and Trust Co. In 1895, the court ruled the income tax unconstitutional, not because taxing income was inherently wrong, but on a narrower, more technical point. The Constitution required certain kinds of direct taxes to be apportioned among the states according to population, and the court determined this income tax violated that requirement. Here's the thing most people don't realize about that ruling. It wasn't really a ruling against the idea of an income tax. It was a ruling that the existing Constitution, as written, made this particular version of it structurally impossible without a change to the document itself. That distinction is the hinge this entire story turns on. The Supreme Court hadn't just struck down a law, it had told reformers, in effect, that the only path forward wasn't legislation. It was amendment. If Congress wanted to tax income permanently, it would have to rewrite the rules of the Constitution to make room for it. For nearly 2 decades after Pollock, that's exactly what a growing coalition of reformers, populists, and eventually mainstream politicians set out to do. Not through another law that could be struck down the same way, through something the Supreme Court couldn't touch, a constitutional amendment. The question is, how do you convince a nation that had twice tried and failed to tax income, once abandoned by its own choice, once struck down by its own courts, to permanently rewrite its founding document to make room for it? The answer takes us into the most quietly consequential political maneuver in this entire story. By 1909, the pressure that had been building since Pollock had reached the highest levels of American politics. And the man who would set the final mechanism in motion wasn't a populist firebrand. It was President William Howard Taft, a figure history remembers as cautious, legally minded, and not exactly a crusader for radical change. Here's the thing most people don't realize about Taft's role in this story. He wasn't necessarily driven by a deep conviction that income should be taxed. Some historians frame his support for a constitutional amendment as, in part, a political maneuver, a way to diffuse growing momentum in Congress for another direct legislative income tax, one that risked being struck down by the courts, just like the 1894 version had been. By channeling that energy toward a constitutional amendment instead, Taft offered reformers a path that couldn't be undone by a single Supreme Court ruling, while, for the moment, keeping the issue at arm's length from immediate law. Whatever the mix of motives, the mechanism moved forward. In 1909, Congress passed the proposed 16th Amendment and sent it to the states for ratification. The text was almost deceptively simple. Congress would have the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes, from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the states, directly overriding the constitutional obstacle that had sunk the income tax in Pollock. State by state, ratification crept forward. Not with fanfare, not with the kind of dramatic public debate you might expect for a change this permanent. It moved through state legislatures quietly, technically, over the better part of 4 years. And then, in February of 1913, the 16th Amendment was ratified. The constitutional wall that Pollock had built was gone. For the first time in American history, there was no legal obstacle left standing between the federal government and a citizen's income. Later that same year, under newly inaugurated President Woodrow Wilson, Congress passed the Revenue Act of 1913, the law that actually put the amendment into practice. And here is where the story reveals its most quietly devastating detail. The 1913 income tax was small, almost reassuringly small. A top rate of around 7% applied only to the highest earners in the country, by most estimates, roughly the wealthiest 1% of the population. For the overwhelming majority of Americans, nothing changed. No form, no withholding, no difference in the paycheck of a farmer, a factory worker, a shopkeeper. That's not an accident of framing. That was the sales pitch. This was presented, explicitly, as a tax on the wealthy, a narrow correction aimed at railroad fortunes and industrial magnates, not a burden that would ever touch an ordinary worker's wages, something for someone else to pay. But here's the mechanism most people miss entirely. The amendment itself placed no ceiling on that rate, and no restriction on how far down the income ladder Congress could eventually reach. The Constitution now said Congress could tax income from whatever source derived. Full stop. There was no promise embedded in the 16th Amendment that it would stay small. There was no clause guaranteeing it would stay confined to the top 1%. The only thing standing between a narrow 1913 tax and a universal one was ordinary legislation. The same Congress that could pass a rate today could raise it, lower the threshold, or expand its reach tomorrow, without ever touching the Constitution again. This is the betrayal, if you want to call it that, not a lie told outright, but a permanent tool, handed over under the calm, reasonable framing of a modest tax on the rich, with absolutely nothing in its design to keep it that way. And within a few decades, it wouldn't stay that way at all. In 1913, the income tax touched roughly 1 out of every 100 Americans. If you were listening to this story back then, as an ordinary worker, a farmer, a shopkeeper, this would have been someone else's problem, a tax for the wealthy, not for you. So here's the question worth asking. How did a tax built for the top 1% become a tax on nearly everyone who has ever earned a paycheck in America? The answer isn't one dramatic moment. It's a slow, compounding series of decisions, each one justified by its own emergency, each one expanding what the 16th Amendment had made possible. The first major expansion came with World War I. The federal government needed enormous sums to fund the war effort, and the income tax, this new flexible tool with no constitutional ceiling, was the obvious lever to pull. Rates climbed. The pool of Americans required to pay grew wider. What started as a tax on the wealthiest sliver of the country began reaching further down the income ladder, one wartime necessity at a time. Then came the Great Depression, and with it, the New Deal, an unprecedented expansion of federal programs, all of which needed funding. And then came World War II, the moment that changed everything most decisively. Here's the thing most people don't realize. The income tax, as most Americans experience it today, taken directly out of a paycheck before the worker ever sees it, wasn't part of the original design at all. It was introduced during World War II through a system called withholding. Instead of citizens setting aside their own tax money and paying it once a year, employers were now required to deduct the tax automatically, every single pay period, and send it directly to the government. This one administrative change did more to transform the income tax than any rate increase ever could. Before withholding, paying income tax required a citizen to actively hand over money he'd already held in his own account. After withholding, the tax simply never arrived in the first place. The money left before it ever felt like it belonged to you. And that's the moment this story finally arrives at your own paycheck. Think about it. Every time you've been paid for a day's work, a portion of what you earned was already gone before the number even reached your bank account. Not because you handed it over. Not because you made a choice that pay period to give a portion of your labor to the federal government. It was simply removed, automatically, by a system built during a wartime emergency over 80 years ago and never dismantled once the war ended. This is why the income tax feels less like a bill you pay and more like a fact of nature, an unquestioned, invisible deduction baked into the very idea of earning money in America. It's why so few people ever stop to ask where that money actually goes, or why it was taken before they had any say in the matter. The system was never designed to be questioned. It was designed to be automatic, quiet, and permanent. Precisely the qualities that made it so different from the tariff-funded republic America ran on for its first 120-plus years. What began in 1913 as a modest, narrow tax on the wealthiest 1% of Americans became, within 3 decades, a mechanism reaching directly into the paycheck of nearly every working person in the country, collected automatically, before anyone had the chance to think twice about it. The republic that once funded itself entirely at the border had, by the middle of the 20th century, built a system that reached directly into the pocket of every citizen who worked for a living, and it never went back. So where does that leave us? It would be easy to tell this story as a simple fall from grace. A pure, tax-free republic corrupted by a single amendment in 1913. But that's not quite honest either. The world before the income tax was not some libertarian paradise. Tariffs were still taxes. They still raised prices on ordinary families. The Whiskey Rebellion proves that even the founding generation resisted federal taxation with real anger, sometimes with real violence. And the income tax itself wasn't imposed by force or deception. It was voted on, debated, ratified by the states, following the very constitutional process the founders themselves built. What changed in 1913 wasn't the existence of taxation. It was the reach of it. The shift from a government that taxed goods at the border to one with a permanent, unrestricted claim on the income of every citizen, expandable by nothing more than an ordinary act of Congress. That's not a conspiracy. It's not a secret cabal pulling strings behind closed doors. It's something more uncomfortable than that. A series of reasonable-sounding decisions, made in daylight, that quietly became permanent. If this story changed the way you think about that deduction on your paycheck, do us a favor, hit that like button, and if you haven't already, subscribe. This channel exists to dig up the moments in American history that don't get taught. The decisions that quietly became permanent without anyone ever being asked to vote on it twice. And before you go, I want to hear from you. Do you think the 16th Amendment was inevitable? Or was there a version of America that could have funded itself another way? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every one. This is just the beginning of this thread. There's another video coming soon that pulls on another thing you've never questioned. Something else that feels permanent, that feels like it's always been there. It isn't. And you're going to want to know how it happened.